remember the 11th of November. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, you will soon enough. Good evening, everyone. I am Dr. Drew Lichtenberg, the resident dramaturg and literary manager here at the Shakespeare Theater. And before we get started discussing Shakespeare and the supernatural, I want to thank tonight's sponsors. The Shakespeare Hour is a component of Shakespeare Everywhere, which is made possible by the visionary support of the Beach Street Foundation. Additional support for Shakespeare Hour Live is generously provided by Nan Beckley, and tonight's episode is sponsored by Catherine McClare. Thank you all so much. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our extraordinary panel that we've assembled tonight to discuss the recently passed, in commemoration of the recently passed Halloween festivities, and also the 5th of November, Guy Fawkes Day. Let me introduce Dr. Martine Green-Rogers, nationally recognized dramaturg and adapter, and tenured associate professor at the State University of New York, New Paltz. Martine, are you with us?
I am. Thank you so much for having me.
And in honor of the usual question that Simon asks, where are you joining us from in the world tonight, Martine?
I am coming from the land of the Lenape, which is West Hurley, New York.
West Hurley. Not, you were telling me before we went on the show, upstate, but maybe considered by Manhattanites to be somewhere upstate of New York City.
Kind of. I think the best way to describe where I am is the mid-Hudson Valley. That'll make most upstaters not angry and want to throw things at me.
Well, that is very helpful context for me. Lovely. I can't wait to talk to you more, Martine. Now let me introduce Dr. Carole Levin, Willa, Cather, Professor of History and Director of Medieval and Renaissance Studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Carole, are you there?
I am.
And are you joining us from Nebraska?
I'm joining you from Lincoln, Nebraska, where the university is, indeed. And I've got just a few more weeks and I'm finished with this very unusual semester of teaching.
You're here. And also joining us is Golden Globe nominee Corey Stoll, known for his work on Netflix's House of Cards, but more pertinently for his stage credits in classic stage companies Macbeth, in the public theaters Troilus and Cressida, Julius Caesar, and Othello. Corey, are you there?
I'm here. Howdy.
And where are you joining us from in the world?
I'm here in Brooklyn, New York.
And it looks like you're in some kind of a den or a game room.
I'm in the basement. Yeah, I've been relegated here because my son is going to bed.
Well, I can relate. I am also in the basement. My 1.5-year-old is upstairs.
He would be very interested in this this topic tonight. He's you know, he definitely sees all of the fall as a time to think about ghosts and goblins and all sorts of scary things. So yeah, I've been marinating in this topic.
Yeah, well, maybe you can show this to him when he's awake tomorrow on our YouTube page when it goes live. When it goes not live, but when it is preserved.
He is 5 years old, so let's.
Maybe we'll try to not be too highbrow maybe tonight. Yeah. Thank you for joining us, Corey.
Good to be here.
Now it is my pleasure to introduce my special guest co-host and my colleague at the Shakespeare Theater, STC's publicist, Dr. Colleen Kennedy. Colleen, are you there?
Hi, Drew. I'm so excited to be here. Like old radio shows, I feel like I've been a long-time listener, first-time caller, by finally getting to be here with you.
Great. Well, you will know all of the running jokes and memes that we've developed over the last 20-something weeks on the Shakespeare Hour. And where are you joining us from, Colleen?
Tonight, I am at my place in Washington, D.C., and like Martine, I just wanted to say I'm also from a geographical part of New York, Buffalo, Western New York, not upstate, Western New York.
So I hear the distinctive twang of Buffalonian in your speaking voice and your accent. So thank you, Colleen, for joining us. Well, without further ado, let's get to the topic. We're talking about tonight the range of the supernatural world as it appears in Shakespeare's plays. And Colleen, how do you come to this question of how Shakespeare uses the element of the supernatural in various ways in his plays? What do you think is the most interesting thing that you want to highlight?
Well, I know we'll be talking more about magic and witches and ghosts and fairies soon, but I think in a lot of ways, so many of the plays, it's about trying to understand how God manifests, or, you know, how through these outward signs. So even though we'll be talking more about those sort of monstrous creatures and creations, I'm thinking also about augury, you know, looking at bird signs, astrology, dream analysis, even something natural like an eclipse. We have a scientific explanation, but in these plays, that's not the definition, right? It's not the sun and the moon crossing paths. It's a premonition, an omen of something bad that's going to happen, or it's a signal of something really unnatural, like a regicide that just occurred. So I think supernatural, you know, it's transcending the natural, but in the Renaissance, ghosts, fairies, and witches are part of the natural, or at least part of the rich fabric and tapestry of everyday life and culture for this time. These things exist, right? Whether benevolent or malevolent, they're really real for Shakespeare and his contemporaries, even though we're starting to think about the early empiricists who are becoming more skeptical of these sort of supernatural and looking for natural explanations for unusual phenomena. And finally, I want to say, I think the theater itself is supernatural, right? So just through spectacle and performing ghosts, witches, fairies, and so on, they're manifested and embodied and become real for the audience once they're on stage.
Yeah, you certainly do get the sense from plays like A Midsummer Night's Dream, for example, that there are so many small picayune details, the names of things, right? Skimming the churn off of the milk, right? That Shakespeare is writing from, on some level, very direct firsthand experience of growing up in Warwickshire, in Stratford-upon-Avon, and hearing these kind of old wives' tales and internalizing them so that they're not just abstract or theoretical things, but as you're saying, Colleen, they are lived experience. Before we move on, I want to just correct myself. Our donor tonight is Catherine McClave, not McClare. Blame my poor handwriting. I'm sorry, Catherine, if you're tuning in. Carole, you were saying before we went on the air that you teach a course regularly on Shakespeare and witches and the supernatural. So what do you want to highlight or hold up for us tonight?
I teach a course called Saints, Witches, and Madwomen. We always do Macbeth, but we really are looking at the culture as well. And I think what's really important is, which Colleen had already mentioned, is how saturated the culture of Elizabeth and James I were in beliefs in magic, in witches, in ghosts. And yet there was some skepticism. But in Elizabeth's time, there was a strong belief in witches. There was a Witchcraft Act, which was made even more severe the year after James became King of England. People believed strongly in ghosts. And even though there was sometimes a question is, do Catholics believe in ghosts or Protestants believe in ghosts or not? It seemed like everybody at some level believed in ghosts. So I think that saturation is something that Shakespeare was really aware of. And I think being Shakespeare both expressed it, but also expressed some cynicism about it.
And yeah, we actually have a question from Anonymous asking us whether we think that Shakespeare believed in supernatural or did he just use these elements as dramatic plot devices? And it seems like you're saying, Carole, that it's impossible to know whether he believed or not, but he's certainly operating off of the knowledge that at least some people in his audience did literally believe in the reality.
Absolutely. And the plays there's in so many of the plays, there are also dreams that are prophetic and magical as well. The Henry VI plays have calling out some spirits and demons. There's a witch, Marjorie Jordan, who calls a spirit before the Duchess of Gloucester. The dead, the many of Richard III's victims come and tell him to spare and die the night before the Battle of Bothworth Field. I think the dreams, magic, ghosts, witches in Macbeth are amazing in what they represent. And as I mentioned, I also think that the magic and possibility of ghosts in The Winter's Tale is really fascinating as well.
Yeah, it's one of those things that once you start noticing not just the characters who are explicitly supernatural, like fairies and ghosts and witches, and we can talk about whether the witches are magical or not, because they don't actually do anything magical in that play, depending on how you read it. The play which shall not be named, right? But as you say, Carole, it's once you start noticing this language of dream, of magic, it's in all of the plays. It pervades the atmosphere culturally. Martine, you are, as a dramaturg and also as a professor, someone who has both practical hands-on experience with this material and also you teach it. So how do you approach the use of the supernatural in Shakespeare's plays?
That's actually a really good question. I think some of it is pointing out some of the fun in the way that Shakespeare thinks about this. So one of my favorite things to sort of riddle my students with is thinking about the way that it is the magic, for example, that is used in the Tempest is so sort of ingrained in the entire universe, the world of this play. Like no one ever says, wait a minute, Prospero's a magician. Like the fact that no one ever questions any of this and just rolls with it is so fascinating to me. And the fact that, you know, his daughter Miranda is just like, oh, this art that you do, which I also just find fascinating, the use of magic as art. Because part of what I feel like happens in the Tempest that you have to think about is the fact that there's this contrast between the learned art of magic that happens in the Tempest versus sort of the evil magic that is represented by like Setebos and by Caliban. So there's like this difference in like caliber of magic and what happens in these worlds. And so, you know, partially because of who I am, one of the things that we'll talk about in my class is sort of that distinction. Like, why is it that the indigenous people of this island are doing magic and that's the evil kind versus like the good kind somehow that Prospero is doing in this world. And then also the question about, you know, why is it okay for him to conjure these storms? Why is it okay for him to conjure all these things? But if anyone else performs magic, there's something inherently problematic about it. So these are the things that we talk about in my classroom.
And doesn't Prospero say at one point, don't worry, it's not black magic?
Right. Which is just so fascinating because like thinking about what is the difference between his magic and the other magic being performed? Is it literally because he has books and a cape?
No.
Or what is it that makes his magic different?
Right. And, you know, when we had Julie Taymor and Helen Mirren and Peter Holland on the show, Julie brought up the fact that Prospero has a very close paraphrase of a speech that Medea originally speaks from Ovid, I believe. So there's also male-female going on here, that if a woman does it, she's a witch. But if Prospero, a man does it, totally good. It's a man, you know, he's just learned. He has a lot of books. He has a library. What do you want from me? Right? So it's gendered and racialized in all these interesting ways once you start to look at it.
Agreed.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah. Corey, you are, of course, somebody who has very direct hands-on practical experience playing these roles. So what strikes you about Shakespeare's use of the supernatural in his plays?
Well, it's, you know, you can't forget that Shakespeare was a player himself, and he was not, you know, he was not somebody who wrote the plays and then sent them off for somebody to, you know, try to make real. He was hands-on, and he's, you know, one thing that's really remarkable in like the magic or the apparition or the visions in Macbeth is how easy they are to play as long as you just follow the lines, you know, is this a dagger which I see before me, the handle toward my hand, come let me clutch thee. I have thee not, and yet I see thee still. It's incredibly prescribed and sort of bringing the audience along with you. And you know, as somebody, you know, I myself am very secular and skeptical. I don't relish the idea of telling a magical tale for the sake of that. But like everything with Shakespeare, it's all on the line. And then, you know, later when in Act 4, when he goes back to the witches and they make this whole pageant showing him the line of succession of Banquo's issue, and showing how it's going to be Banquo's line that becomes the kings of Scotland and then England. It's a similar sort of thing where Macbeth is sort of narrating this vision, but it's become completely scrambled. And you know, when I played this was the hardest scene to do, because you know, thou art too like the spirit of Banquo down. He's talking to one apparition. Thy crown does sear mine eyeballs, and thy hair, thou other gold-bound brow, is like the first. So now he's already saying there's two. A third is like the former. Filthy hags, why do you show me this? A fourth, start eyes. And it just gets completely garbled in that sort of very, you know, the dagger that was leading him in this very steady path toward the murder. Now, the same sort of vision that, you know, is Shakespeare's having Macbeth embody, in some ways, the audience, showing, you know, Macbeth narrates what the audience can't see because it would be impossible to show all this. It's one step in front of the other, and yet within the same play, he can multiply the complexities of these visions and create this spectacle that you could never show on an Elizabethan stage.
I think that is such a fascinating idea, Corey, that the ghosts are almost like a map of Macbeth's mind in the play, and that it starts off being very linear. Right. And by the end of the play, it's kind of garbled and shooting in all these directions.
Yeah, and I think, you know, you can really see it in like the different types of horror that are made now. Like there's the mediocre horror, which is there's and every man or every woman goes to a cabin or whatever and is, you know, from the outside in, you know, attacked by these horrors, and you see how they deal with it or don't. And it doesn't really tell you anything about that person. And then you have, you know, like this sort of new group of, you know, there's like Get Out or Babadook or, you know, It Follows, where it's a manifestation of these anxieties that we all have, and that this character has particularly. And I think, you know, the same goes for horror as it does for any art, which is that the more granular and specific and concrete you can get, the more complex and universal you can get.
We have a question from viewer Barry, who asks, can it be that ghosts are psychological devices exploring the minds of the people seeing the ghosts? And it's, you know, it seems to conform to your reading, Corey, but we also have the ghost in Hamlet. We have the ghost of Caesar and Julius Caesar, who haunts Brutus, who does a very similar thing where Brutus says like, oh, I'm going to stab myself in the stomach. And then at the end of the play, he literally does that same thing, right?
Well, what's so great about the way Shakespeare does it is that he, within each of those plays, he contradicts himself. So when Hamlet sees his father's ghost at the beginning of the play, you know, Horatio and Bernardo and Marcellus, they all see the ghost too. So the ghost must be real. And then when he sees the ghost when he's in Gertrude's bedchamber, she's like, "What are you looking at?" And the same thing with Macbeth, where the witches are seen by Banquo, but then when he sees Banquo in the banquet, nobody can see what he's seeing. So I think Shakespeare is very consciously playing with the audience and saying, "This is real. No, it's not real. It's real. It's not real," and putting them in the same position as these protagonists who don't know if it's real or not.
Another question. Yeah, Carole, you have a thing you want to add. You're muted, Carole.
I think it's very interesting in the first scene with the witches. Yes, it's both Macbeth and Banquo, and the witches don't do any magic. They tell him perhaps prophecies, but there's no magic. In the second scene, only Macbeth sees the witches, and then we do have magic, which makes me wonder if even that scene is somehow a dream, a hallucination, because Macbeth asks at the end, "Did you see them?" And I think it's Lennox says, no one passed here. So I thought that is really an interesting difference too. And another way, perhaps, as Corey was saying, that Shakespeare is kind of playing with his audience.
Yeah, Corey, when you were talking about Cabin in the Woods movies, it made me think of my favorite horror movie, Evil Dead and Evil Dead 2, which take this in a kind of comic direction. But similarly, it's the study of an individual and their mind, and we're not sure if what we're seeing is real or if it's hallucinatory. One final question about ghosts from Russell. Is there a difference or increase in Shakespeare's use of ghosts in plays written after versus before periods of plague? Maybe we can just chew on that during the break, because I'm looking at everybody's faces. Speaking of which, we are sort of at our early interval point, and Simon has recorded a video greeting from London, which Gordon tells me is a little bit longer. So I think we should go maybe to that now, and then we can come back and talk about passages. Are we ready, Gordon?
Hello. Welcome to my weekly postcard from London. I hope you're all well. Goodness me, America is undergoing enormous changes, and meanwhile, I am in my second week of rehearsals for Romeo and Juliet, the movie. And this postcard is a way of updating you all about how it's going. And this week, I'm joined by our two movement directors, John Goddard and Shelley Maxwell. Hello, John and Shelley.
Hi, Simon.
Hi, Simon. Hi. So, John, you actually worked in Washington on Time in Athens.
I did, yeah.
Do you have good memories of your trip to the Klein Theatre?
I loved it. It was a whirlwind trip because it was just a week, but I really enjoyed it. I loved the audiences there, and it was a really exciting time.
Great.
But they closed soon after. That was
right. We didn't get to the end of our run, sadly, as I'm sure many of you will remember. But it was a great run, and it makes me feel nostalgic to see you all again in the Klein. Let's hope we're getting it soon. So, Shelley, how has it been choreographing Romeo and Juliet, including one of the most famous dance sequences in theatre history? Challenging at the best of times, but here we are in COVID. How's all that going?
In COVID times, it's going really well because I'm partnered with John Goddard, and who better to be partnered with? Mm-hmm. And the National Crosshair is doing a really good job with keeping us on our toes with COVID regulations. Mm-hmm. But equally, I think it's quite interesting doing it not only as the theatre production, but something that we're doing for film.
And how is John working on film different from theatre? How are you finding the difference?
Since we locked down in the UK, I just actually took a job working on Matilda films. So that's my first job working with dance and film. And it's been interesting because it's just about thinking about frames for me. So I would normally think about the proscenium, what's the audience experience and how the waves of things coming forward. And now I'm thinking about the frames, where's the camera going to go, and how does each frame tell the picture and the narrative. So it's quite interesting. It's just a different way of thinking.
Well, look, I'm actually finding the transition quite hard insofar as I've actually given up frames or cameras. I don't know anything about them, and I feel like little learning is a dangerous thing, as Alexander Pope, I think, once remarked. So I'm basically rehearsing it as a play and trying to use the expertise that I've got and hoping that our colleagues and collaborators in the film world will then come in and help, indeed, as John says, photograph it and piece it all together meaningfully. And actually what's fascinating for me is that some challenges never go away. What is the story about? What is it a metaphor for? How do we tell the story clearly about who's who, and who's related to who, and who's one's friend and who is one's enemy? And actually, working on the long party scene today in the play, I'm reminded all over again of how it really is one of the great scenes, one of the hardest scenes in Shakespeare, and that Shakespeare writes in the big scene of the Capulet party, lots of little scenes within the same scene, and trying to kind of piece all those together and understand how they're different and what stories link to each other. It's really, it's delicate work, isn't it?
Yeah.
Delicate is a good word. And I think equally it's a good word because you also want to break it and make it a little bit more violent. Because we think about, in that scene, who are friends and who are allies, and how do they therefore populate the space, which we found out today, that there was a lot of gravitation within tribes from certain people. And then we had a very kind of barren, open space in the middle of the rehearsal room, which we then have to figure out, how do we get people to break it and feel brave enough to cross the space and to do silly things like, I'm going to go and get a drink from the bar, because after all, we're at a party in 2020.
Exactly. And also, so we're no longer on stage, we are at a party, and we're also at a party on film. So actually what we did realise is that you have a small scene between Lady Capulet and Tybalt talking. Maybe you don't need to worry about what everyone else is doing off camera, which of course you have to worry about on stage.
Yeah.
So it's trying to also understand where the big efforts lie. So that is where we're at. You need to get back to Shakespeare and the supernatural. Thanks for watching the Shakespeare Hour. My thoughts are with you in Washington, as well as here in London, as well as in Shakespeare's Verona. It's goodbye from me. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. So back to Shakespeare and the supernatural. And, we've already heard some passages read from you, Corey. I feel like I could spend an hour just listening to you read and gloss Shakespeare. It's so fantastic. I think it would be great to take a little bit less of a wide look and get more granular the way we were doing with the Scottish play. So basically, Shakespeare has three types of supernatural beings that appear in his plays: fairies, ghosts, who we were talking about before the break, and witches, who we touched on a little bit. And I guess you could count magicians, gods, goddesses, oracles. Yeah, I mean, it's complicated, but like for the sake of simplicity, let's say fairies, ghosts, and witches. Colleen, do you have something to share with us about fairies, I believe?
I do. Fairies and just more fairy tales and old wives' tales more generally. In The Winter's Tale, young Prince Mamilius, he offers to share a story. He says, "A sad tale's best for winter. I have one of sprites and goblins." And then, of course, he gets cut off and doesn't get to finish his tale. But, that sort of sets up this oral tradition that we know Ovid, and we know Plutarch, and we know Holinshead, and we know all these male authors that are literate, that are publishing things, but that there is so much, especially when we think about fairy lore and folklore and old wives' tales in these pieces, that are oral tales that are told by women, the nurses, the housemaids, older women in the houses, and they're preserved in the plays, and we have references to them, but we don't know the tale tellers. And I think that's very sad in some sort of ways. I also think of, when Beth sees Banquo's ghost and Lady M says, "Oh, these flaws and starts and postures to true fear would well become a woman's story out of winter's fire, authorized by her grandam." Right, so it sort of dismisses the sort of fairy tales and folklore that are told by women, dismissed, but that's the basis of these things, right? Where in ancient Athens, there are no fairies in ancient Greek, right? These are British fairies that are running around. There's sprites in the Tempest. Merry Wives of Windsor, all the kids dress up as fairies. Mercutio talks about Queen Mab making nightmares. So, well, he says, actually, don't trust her, don't trust the dreams she makes. Carole would be the expert on that, of course. But I think about fairies, that they can bestow fertility on couples and crops, but they can be really destructive and scary too. They can steal children and put little changelings in the place. They can destroy harvests. They can pinch people. So I think that's all I'll say about fairies for now.
Well, and speaking to your point, Colleen, in The Merry Wives of Windsor, which is not a super well-known Shakespeare play, it's the women, Mistress Ford and Mistress Page, who are the authors of that play within a play at the end, right? They're the ones who have the idea to dress up the children as fairies and trick Falstaff. And in The Winter's Tale, it's Mamilius with his mother, Hermione, wanting to hear a story of sprites and goblins. And that's the scene where Leontes comes in and kind of cruelly snatches him away. And it begins the tragic momentum of the first half of the play. So it does feel like there is textual justification for your reading, that Shakespeare is writing about this non-patriarchal line of storytelling that is handed down orally from one generation to the next. Was he bounced on his mother, Mary Arden's knee, hearing tales of sprites and goblins, Winter's Tale, to be told by on a fire by one's grandam? I mean, he does have the Forest of Arden in his plays, right? So I think it's a fascinating idea that embedded in these stories of fairies is a kind of tribute to these women whose names maybe we don't know or whose books we never will read. Anne Hathaway, we think, Shakespeare's wife, signed her name with an X, right? Instead of signing it. Is there anything, Carole, as the expert, as the resident expert, that you want to add to Colleen's exegesis?
Well, fairies are absolutely, I think, believed in. Fairy tales were very potent. One of the things I think are fascinating about fairies is the idea of changelings, and this appears in a number of Shakespeare's plays, and the thought that fairies could exchange a human baby for a fairy, or take a baby from one cradle and move the baby to another cradle in exchange. So I think that they were very strong. If I could move on to ghosts, I could stay with The Winter's Tale, if that's all right with you. So one of the, I think the major questions in The Winter's Tale, and it's one of my favorite plays, is at the end is, has Hermione been hidden for 16 years? Or is she, in fact, did she die? And is she brought back to life by the kind of good magic faith of Paulina? And I think that one of the great beliefs about ghosts in the Elizabethan Jacobean period is that the easiest way ghosts could communicate with the living, the dead could communicate with the living, was through dreams. And so this is toward the very end of Act 3 with Antigonus, when he's about to abandon Perdita. And he said, "Come forward, babe. I've heard, not believe, the spirits of the dead may walk again. If such thing be true, thy mother appeared to me last night, for ne'er was dream so like a waking. To come, a creature sometimes her head on one side, some another. I never saw a vessel of like sorrow." And then he asks at the end, "Dreams are toys, yet for this once, yea, superstitiously, I will be squared by this. I do believe Hermione has suffered death." And I thought that was really powerful, because we don't know when she swoons whether she has actually died or not. And I think it can depend a lot on the production. I love productions of Winter's Tale, and when I saw Leontes just gets right on the floor and he's hugging her, and I think would definitely know if she were alive or not at that moment. But it seems to me that this is a very clear signal that Shakespeare is giving, that in fact Hermione has died. And I thought it was really interesting that she is a ghost who comes to talk about what is going to happen to her daughter. And then when she's brought back to life, it's because she has finally is able to be reunited with that daughter.
And it's a very unusual scene for Shakespeare because it's Antigonus describing this dream he's had of a ghost who appeared to him in his dream, unlike Macbeth and unlike Hamlet and unlike Julius Caesar and unlike Richard III, where the ghosts literally appear in the stage directions and there's no question about whether the ghost is real or not. The ghost exists in the world of the play. But in The Winter's Tale, it's really up to the director, it's up to the audience. It's very, very uncertain. I mean, we know that there's a bear in that play.
Yes.
You say exit pursued by a bear, right? But we don't know if the ghost of Hermione is real or not. And also the fact that she appears at the end of the play as a statue is so strange and so interesting. She appears as an artwork that comes to life. And it reminds me of something you were saying, Corey, before we went on about this link between ghosts and the imagination, right? This way in which Shakespeare understands ghosts on some level to be an extension of his imaginative powers as a playwright.
And I mean, I think also Shakespeare had a real habit of making everything a metaphor of theater. You know, obviously, all the world's a stage, and the Hamlet's, talking to the players, and I think all of these supernatural elements, whether it's ghosts or fairies or witches, or Prospero's magic, it's all sort of on a spectrum with the suspension of disbelief that you have to bring to any piece of theater. We're all agreeing that these people are pretending to be this thing. So if we've gone this far, can we believe that two sets of twins would get mixed up in this crazy comedy of errors? Would we believe that the sort of ridiculous coincidences of Desdemona's handkerchief would happen in that way? And so little by little you're being sort of brought into this world of unbelievable things, but it's pleasurable because you're sort of brought along piece by piece. It doesn't all happen at once.
Right, you go deeper and deeper and deeper into this illusion until it is real to you, right? Even though you know it to be fake. It's so many thoughts, Corey, but you mentioned the comedy of errors. The abbess at the end of that play is a kind of supernatural character, or at least ex machina, who appears out of a church and resolves everything. But also, this idea of the theatrical metaphor is so clear at the end of The Winter's Tale when they describe the statue and they talk about how she's wrinkled and she looks as if she's aged 16 years and she looks as if she's breathing, right? And then Paulina, who is interesting to read in terms of what you were saying, Martine, about Prospero, because Paulina she says, I can use magic and it's white magic, right? Don't worry, it's not black magic. And she says to Leontes, it is required you to awake your faith and the statue will move and come to life, which, I mean, isn't that the suspension of disbelief right there? Martine, do you have a passage for us from the Tempest to read?
I do. Before we get into that, one of the things I want to talk about that to preface it is thinking a little bit back to what I was talking about in terms of art and charms and what is the difference between like the magic that Prospero does and the magic that other people on this island do. And it's interesting because I think in some respects that the crudest way to boil it down is that it's about harm reduction, because Prospero is very specific in terms of how he talks about the art that he does. And so back to case in point, in Act 1, Scene 2 of The Tempest, Prospero says, "'Tis time. I should inform thee further. Lend thy hand and pluck my magic garment from me. So lie there, my art. Wipe thou thine eyes. Have comfort. The direful spectacle of the wreck, which touched the very virtue of compassion in thee, I have with such provision in mine art so safely ordered that there is no soul, no, not so much perdition as a hair, betid to any creature in the vessel which thou heardst cry, which thou sawest sink. Sit down, for thou must know further. And I think it's interesting that part of what he says is like the art that I'm doing is mostly about, granted, there maybe you could argue there's a selfish element to it because he's trying to like right wrongs and like put his world back to order. But in the end, he's saying that the art that I am doing does not cause harm. Now we could have a whole lot of conversations about what harm means, and we can get into like his treatment of like Ariel and Caliban, but that's a whole other story for another day. But you know, in some ways he's saying like, I have not harmed anyone in this ginormous weather thing that I have created, and therefore that is what makes the work that I do, the art that I do, not bad. And I think this is really interesting, and part of me wonders if, like, back to the person in me that's always looking for a conspiracy theory where there's no conspiracy theory to be found, if this has a little bit to do with when the Tempest was written and the emergence of the King James version of the Bible, like, is, you know, he trying to separate, like, you know, this idea of the magic that like could be condemned by the Bible, you know, is he trying to sort of say, no, I'm not doing that, I'm doing this other stuff over here. So anyway, I'm done with conspiracy theories, but these are the things rolling around in my head.
Well, it does feel like by the time we get to the Tempest, what has been an internal dilemma for a character like Macbeth, right? I mean, he talks about sound and fury signifying nothing, right? It is a tale told by an idiot, right? So he is he's looking at this theatrical metaphor of life for life and saying it's meaningless. And Prospero is like, I'm creating the theater. I'm creating this theatrical metaphor, and I'm not going to hurt anybody. It's not full of sound and fury, but it has meaning, maybe. It's not going to hurt you. I'm just going to do all this hocus pocus and magic, and maybe at the end of the day, we'll have a moral. Because he starts off like a very Macbeth-like figure, and by the end of the play, he's very magnanimous and forgiving everybody who has wronged him. Question from viewer Stanley. In our day, when ghosts aren't so much accepted as real, speak for yourself, Stanley, what device might be used instead? And I think, Corey, you were saying horror movies are one example of a kind of equivalent to Shakespeare, which reminds me of this comment from viewer Beverly Sauer. I'm reminded that the really scary creatures in Stephen King are not the ghostly monsters, but rather the evil people who live in all of the towns.
Yeah, well, and to go off of what Martine was saying, I think conspiracy theories are, come from a similar place of this this feeling of a disordered world where we have no control. And, even though these conspiracy theories are, if it's QAnon or whatever, they're sinister, and they're not a picture of a good universe, but at least there's an order to it, and I think that can be soothing to a lot of people who want to have that sense of meaning and control.
So in other words, look to Fox News or One America News Network for an equivalent. I don't want to put words in your mouth.
I am sure, there are crazy people on both sides.
Viewer Alicia says that's similar to Guillermo del Toro's work, where the monsters and the ghosts are not nearly as scary as the humans in the story. If you think of Pan's Labyrinth, the true monsters are the Francoists, fascists in the story. And the ghosts are, if anything, just a projection that comes out of society. So it does seem like we're moving organically towards the equivalent in Elizabethan and Jacobean England of a conspiracy theory, which were witches, right? We know that James I, King James, believed that witches were real and ascribed fantastic but also political meaning to them, right? Doesn't he blame witches for delaying his marriage to this queen from, I believe, Bohemia, who is sailing, and there's witches that are interfering with the winds? Help me, Carole, here. Yes.
It's from Denmark, and absolutely, James was very convinced, especially while he was King of Scotland, about witches and about evil magic. And he said that one way he knew that this woman was a witch was after he had gone to fetch Anne from Denmark and the terrible difficulties of it and married her there. And this was when they were back in Scotland. And he said, she told me what happened on my wedding night. Well, she may have just had a good imagination, but he so believed it. And in 1591, he really went after people he thought of as witches, in part because there were worries about a conspiracy against him. And he harangued juries. He also was so convinced, and James thought of himself as such a scholar, he wrote a whole book called Demonology. And being the King of Scotland, of course, it was published. And for those of you in Washington, D.C., when the Folger Shakespeare Library finally opens again, the Folger owns a beautiful manuscript copy of Demonology. I will say that when James becomes King of England, the witchcraft statute is the worst, that it's the most severe than ever was. Though later in his reign, he also was very interested in finding out people who were faking things, as well as actual witches.
And Martine, weren't you holding up a book of Shakespeare's Demonology before we went on?
It's actually the dictionary that Arden put out that gets into a lot of the different contexts in which we find sort of magicians and demonology and the people and who's doing what, and cross-referencing. It's by Gibson and Ezra, and I love this just because, like, if you're interested in sort of digging into the sort of demons and demonology of Shakespeare in the same way that you might use the lexicon, this is a really great reference.
Yeah.
Colleen, I see you.
Colleen.
Yeah, I think, of course, we have the Scottish play, but there's a whole flurry of witch plays that come out. Ben Jonson does The Mask of Queens that has a bunch of witches. There's The Witch of Edmonton, which is fantastic and has a devil who is inside a black lab named Tom, who can speak. The Witches of Lancashire is a little later on, but there's these witch pamphlets that are being produced all the time with these different sort of women giving birth to litters of bunny rabbits and using their witchcraft for murder. And so there's just everybody's really excited and super into witches. It becomes part of the popular culture, and then is also manifested in high culture when it becomes part of plays and masks. Masks are being performed with Queen Anna of Denmark for King James.
And obviously it remains a part of popular culture all the way to The Crucible by Arthur Miller in the 1950s, where it is still something that, it happens in England too, with these puritanical witch hunts, which is certainly an idea that has a lot of resonance today. So it seems like you're implying, maybe Colleen, maybe Carole, that if Shakespeare was writing Macbeth today, it would be more of a Q type scenario that or a kind of left-wing conspiracy, right? About this thing that the president was paranoid about and was using to rally his troops. Yeah, Carole. You're muted.
I think it's important also for us all to remember, just as there's such dangers with these conspiracy theories and this othering of people, that people actually died because of these witchcraft beliefs. That this was both a case of actual trials where mostly women, though not all women, who were accused. And in England, they were hanged as witches unless they used magic to kill their husbands, and then they would be burned to death. But these beliefs caused deaths. And I think the fact that we still have witch hunts today which are very dangerous, really reflects these beliefs are still very much with us. We're just, I think the witches became the other now. It's different groups who are the other, but I think it plays the same role.
And when you're acting, say, Corey, as Macbeth, it's a very interesting dynamic between him and the witches in the play. First of all, they're not really witches. They're Wëird sisters, right? They're only identified as witches once or twice in the play, and that's as an insult, as an othering. A roint witch, the rump-fed Runyon cries, right? But they're sort of at the bottom of the social pyramid at the beginning of the play. They're these like weird, are they homeless people? Are they war refugees? Are they vagabonds? And by the end of the play, they're untouched by all of this danger. They still exist, and Macbeth has fallen. So when you're playing opposite the witches, how do you approach those scenes? Do you not go near them? Do you treat them as magical? Do you treat them as real?
Well, I've only done one production of it, and in that production, they were actually up in the sort of balcony area for the most part, and there was this separating. But you know, to talk about the sort of hatred for these witches, it was also remarkable. Every night, there were times where I could look out at the audience when the witches were chanting. You know, and you know, there's some question about whether Shakespeare actually wrote the witches stuff because it's so different. But it does, you know, it goes from iambic pentameter to iambic trimeter, and it's a very different sort of rhythm, and it's like a children's nursery. And every night you could see people in the audience, just their faces lit up, chanting along with the witches. I mean, part of it is just sort of, they're excited that they're familiar with the language and that they can speak Shakespeare. But I think there's also, with all of these supernatural entities, there's this simultaneous attraction and repulsion. You know, that they represent, you know, a more Dionysian or you know, something closer to you know, our id than the superego world that we live in, and you can see it in a very palpable way when they come on stage.
Yeah, or as they say, fair is foul and foul is fair, right? It's these opposites are bound up together, which leads me to this question from Reed about the religious conflicts between Catholics and Protestants at the time, and this idea that supernatural beings are referring back to pagan and even pre-Christian beliefs. Is Shakespeare reflecting this kind of pre-Christian belief amongst his audience? And how would that have played at the time with the religious or political authorities? We'll just let that one, you know, simmer out there with our panel. Comment from viewer Catherine mentions August Wilson's fences having a supernatural element. The closing gesture, Martine is making a gesture.
Well, mostly just because before we started, I talked about how I did a 3-hour lecture at school today on August Wilson. So one of the things that we did touch upon was this idea of the supernatural character that you find in a lot of Wilson's plays. So, you know, you get Hambone, you get Gabriel and Fences, all of that. And it's really interesting because one of the things, and I think they use, both Wilson and Shakespeare use these characters similarly, like it's about the prophesying, and, you know, and it's almost the Cassandra complex that happens in all of, like in a lot of Shakespearedom as well as in Wilson, where like these characters are doomed not to necessarily be listened to because what they're saying is seen as crazy, as opposed to what it could actually be, which is just truth and foresight. So I think that's fascinating. I'm going to be ruminating about that for a hot minute.
Well, actually, it reminds me of Terrell McCraney, the great playwright, who was at Yale when August Wilson was writing Radio Golf. And you think of Terrell's writing, you know, in the Red and Brown Water and the brother-sister plays, he's a much more mystic, spiritualist writer, but he has said that he took that directly from from Wilson's writing, that it was there in the plays. And now Terrell, of course, is the head of playwriting at Yale. One final question from Nancy and Jack G about Shakespeare's non-believers, his religious skeptics, including Cassius and Hotspur, making the link to the Spanish Inquisition, which stopped trying alleged witches as superstition. Is it possible Shakespeare himself was a skeptic and that Cassius and Percy are his mouthpieces in the plays?
Well, I don't know about the Spanish Inquisition and that part of the history. That's definitely not my area of expertise. But I will say that it's folly to say that any one character in any Shakespeare play is Shakespeare's mouthpiece. He is everyone, you know, and no one. But he's definitely, I don't think, you know, you can, there's times, you know, there's wisdom in every character that he puts forth, and there's also things that are clearly that are folly that he puts in people's mouths. So I just from that perspective, I don't think, you know, he never really lets you know.
I think you get a sense of that when you work on the plays, that there is so much to be celebrated in the not knowing what Shakespeare believed. So much to be celebrated in the mystery of Shakespeare, the mysteries of the imagination, the mysteries of the subconscious, as you're saying, Corey. And I actually think that's like a very good note to end on, because this has been an hour of the Shakespeare Hour. Yes, Martine, yes, Piers. Join us, please, next week. We will be talking about one of my favorite plays. We've actually talked about it a bunch tonight, The Winter's Tale. Joining me will be director Aaron Arbus and actresses Linda Emond and Makira Kakar, joining us to discuss this miraculous and misunderstood work. Colleen, Corey, Martine, Carole, I want to thank you all for joining us. I want to wish you a very happy post Guy Fawkes Day. And I want to tell everyone at home that I'll see you next Wednesday.